Before we begin, please note that this episode includes discussions of graphic violence, poverty, and harsh living conditions. It may also contain outdated terms relevant to the times discussed. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome back to London's Dark Archives. In our journey through the Whitechapel murders, we now arrive at the tragic story of Annie Chapman. Annie's murder, which took place in the early hours of September the 8th, 1888, marks a crucial point in the series of killings attributed to Jack the Ripper. As the second confirmed victim of this brutal killer, Annie's death not only shocked the Eastend, but also solidified the idea that a monstrous force was stalking the streets of Whitechapel. Annie Chapman, also known as Dark Annie, was born Eliza Ann Smith on September 25th, 1841 in Paddington, London. She was the daughter of George Smith, a soldier, and Ruth Chapman. Annie's early life was somewhat stable. She married John Chapman, a coachman, in 1869, and the couple had 3 children, but their lives were marred by tragedy. Their eldest daughter died at a very young age, and their only son was born severely disabled, which placed a heavy strain on the family. Like many women of her time, Annie unfortunately struggled with alcoholism, which eventually led to the breakdown of her marriage. By 1881, Annie and John had separated, and she began a downward spiral into poverty. After the separation, Annie found herself in and out of workhouses trying to make ends meet by taking on various jobs, including domestic service. However, the lure of alcohol and the harsh realities of life in the East End often led her back to the bottle. In 1888, Annie was living in Crossingham's lodging house at 35 Dorset Street in Spitalfields. Now, Dorset Street was infamous, even in the crime-ridden East End, known for its squalor, violence and prostitution. The lodging house where Annie lived was a typical lodging house at the time. It was overcrowded, it was dirty, and it was filled with people trying to survive by any means necessary. For a bed at Crossingham's, Annie needed to pay 8p per night, a sum she often struggled to gather. She frequently pawned her few possessions, and like many women in her situation, she often had to turn to the streets when necessary. On the night of September 7th, 1888, Annie was seen drinking in the Britannia pub on Dorset Street, a common haunt for local residents. She was in a poor state of health, suffering from tuberculosis and malnutrition, and had been drinking heavily. She was last seen alive by a fellow lodger who spoke with her outside the lodging house around 1:45 a.m. Annie said she was going out to try and earn some money to pay for her bed, and that was the last time anyone saw Annie alive. In the early hours, September the 8th, around 5:30 a.m, John Davis, an elderly resident of number 29 Ambury Street, discovered Annie's mutilated body in the backyard of the house. Ambury Street, like much of Whitechapel, was a densely populated street, and off of it was narrow alleyways and dark corners. The house itself was run down, multi-occupancy, and typical of the East End, with numerous tenants sharing cramped living spaces. Annie's body was found lying on the ground near the back steps. Her throat had been slashed deeply, nearly decapitating her, and her abdomen had been brutally mutilated, with several organs removed and placed around her body. The scene was horrifying and grotesque, even more so than the earlier murder of Mary Ann Nichols. The killer had clearly taken more time with Annie, displaying a level of brutality and precision that shocked the authorities. The first police officer on the scene was PC Joseph Chandler, who immediately summoned medical assistance. Dr. George Baxter Phillips arrived shortly thereafter and conducted a preliminary examination. Dr. Phillips noted that the killer possessed some anatomical knowledge, as the mutilation suggested a familiarity with the human body. This led to speculation that the killer might be a doctor or a butcher, further fueling public fear and fascination. At this point, the rumours of Leather Apron began to gain traction. Now, Leather Apron was a nickname given to a local man called John Pizer, a Polish Jewish immigrant who worked as a bootmaker. He was widely feared in the area, known for harassing and threatening local prostitutes. Many believed he was responsible for the recent murders, and his reputation made him a prime suspect in the eyes of the public. The press seized on the Leather Apron story, with sensational headlines stoking fear and anti-Semitic sentiments among the residents of Whitechapel. John Pizer was arrested on September the 10th, just 2 days after Annie's murder. He was found hiding in his mother's house, which only increased suspicion. However, Pizer had alibis for the nights of the murders, and after a thorough investigation, he was released without charge. Despite this, the Leather Apron moniker stuck, and the theory inspired continued to haunt the community. The press coverage of Annie Chapman's murder was intense, with newspapers like The Times, The Daily Telegraph and The Star dedicating extensive columns to the story. The Star in particular was instrumental in spreading the Leather Apron theory, contributing to the growing hysteria in London. The idea of a single monstrous killer began to take hold, and the term Ripper was starting to circulate, though it had not yet fully crystallised into the infamous name we know today. Several witnesses come forward with statements regarding Annie's final hours. Elizabeth Long, a local resident, claimed to have seen Annie speaking with a man outside number 29 Ambury Street around 5:30am. She described the man as dark complexioned, wearing a deerstalker hat, and had a shabby genteel appearance. However, like many witness statements from this period, the description was too vague and unhelpful in identifying a suspect. The police were now under increasing pressure to solve the case, and they began to link the murders of Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman. They saw clear similarities in the modus operandi, the deep throat cuts, the abdominal mutilations, and the precision of the attacks suggested a single, highly dangerous individual. Ambury Street itself was no stranger to crime. The narrow, crowded streets of Whitechapel provided a perfect cover for a killer to strike and then disappear back into the light. Pubs in the area, such as the 10 Bells and the Britannia, become hotbeds of rumour and speculation. Stories of the murders spread like wildfire, with each telling becoming more exaggerated and more terrifying. The East End's long tradition of storytelling come into full play as residents shared their fears and suspicions in the dark, smoky corners of these establishments. Now, let me share my thoughts on the murder of Annie Chapman. In my view, this was the work of the same killer who murdered Mary Ann Nichols. The similarities are too striking to ignore. The deep throat slashes, the mutilations, the choice of victim. It's clear that a killer's modus operandi is beginning to emerge, and with it, a pattern of brutality that would soon plunge Whitechapel into further terror. As for Leather Apron, while he was undoubtedly a detestable character who was feared in the area, I do not believe he was Jack the Ripper. His arrest, however, highlights the panic and fear that was starting to grip the East End, fed by sensational stories circulating in the press and the local pubs. The East End has a long tradition of storytelling, and my own family, my grandparents, aunties, uncles, family friends have always shared stories of the past. I can only imagine the EastEnders of 1888 doing the same, and as gossip spread from house to house and pub to pub, Jack may not have had his infamous name yet, but by the time of Annie Chapman's murder, it had truly arrived. As we continue our exploration of Whitechapel murders, the terror and mystery surrounding these killings will only deepen. Join us next time as we delve into the story of the double event. Thank you for joining us, and don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming episodes. Stay tuned and stay safe.